I'd like to open up the Mayor Commission work session of September 16, 2019. And let's dive right into item 1, which is a public realm action plan. Who's presenting?
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners.
Good morning.
It's been a couple years since we did the Public Realm Action Plan, and we realized that the only folks that were involved in that process were the Mayor and Commissioner Nearing. So we thought it was a perfect opportunity to come back and kind of refresh the goals and the objectives that we're trying to meet with the Public Realm Action Plan. So I'd like to introduce Matt Lister from GEL and Kate DeSantis. Matt's been Managing Director of GEL for 5.5 years in the New York office, and Kate's been with them 4 years, and she's a project manager that's been helping drive a lot of the projects with me here in West Palm.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Thanks for having us here again. We always love being back in West Palm Beach and seeing how much transformation is happening. Before I began, I wanted to ask a question of you all to just go with me on a thing here. I've been doing this a lot when I visit other places, and I wanted to ask if you could just sit for a second and think of a memorable experience that you've had in a city. And it could be here, but it could be other cities as well. So would you mind just thinking about that for a second and getting that image in your head? And I want you to think about what made that experience memorable. Does everybody have an image? Would anybody be willing to share their memory really quick? This goes much better if somebody actually does it. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking in proximity, so I was right across the street at Field of Greens, and it's a very popular lunch spot, so there wasn't a whole lot of space, extra seats available, and I was waiting for a few others to join me, so I had just me sitting at a table of 4, and somebody was looking for a seat, and so I didn't want him to think that I was just being rude and taking up a table of 4, so I offered him to sit down next to me because my folks were running late. And we ended up striking up a conversation and realized we had something in common, and ended up being a great situation. So
That's awesome. That's great. And so the thing that made that memorable was that interaction probably between people. Does anybody else share your memory?
I was in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and the greenery in the park was, just stood out.
Good. So in that case, it wasn't an interaction; it was just the environment itself.
Right.
And so that lands itself as a memory. Anyone else?
I was in Boston recently and had the occasion to just walk around the city down by what's the place by Faneuil Hall. That's what it was. Yes.
Nice. That was good.
But I wasn't there with Rick. No. But no, it was a beautiful day, which is rare in Boston, and so I just had the occasion to walk from the hotel, and I was with some family members, and we, just the walking between the hotel and Faneuil Hall and exploring the city by foot was unique.
That's great. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. I asked that of lots of people. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is, usually people talk about something delicious that they ate, or they were overcome by the greenery, or they had a personal human connection, right, with somebody else. And often what I think is interesting is that it does come down to that human connection piece, about creating places that foster human connection, creating places that are actually about human scale places that feel good to a human being. If you ask architects that question, they're all going to talk about the building, so I don't like asking architects about it, actually. I want to hear what other people have to say. So I want to thank you for that, and I'd like to just have people keep that in mind when I start going through some of the stuff here. So I was asked to come and talk a little bit about overall what Gail's approach has been, and then some highlights of what has happened over the last few years, and where we've seen some successes and where we think there may be some more challenges going forward. So I'm going to burn through this as quickly as possible. You know, we are a firm that has offices in New York and San Francisco and in Copenhagen. We've worked in over 250 cities all over the world. We've worked in really small towns. We've worked in big cities. We've been studying how people interact in cities for almost 40 years. The practice is about 20 years old. We've got 65 people in the firm, and 12 of them are in New York, which is the office that I run. And we've been having so much fun actually working down here with you all in West Palm Beach and sharing that story. We'll talk a little bit about this with other cities that we work in, because we think there's so much here actually to learn from, which would be great to also talk about. I want to just talk a little bit too about the stakes. You know, we're all in a room right now. All of you have lots on your mind because you are in the practice of making cities. And that means that you're thinking about banner headline issues, right? Like equity and economic development and affordability and public health and public safety. These are big topics. You know, from a physical health perspective, we know that we've got 5 million annual deaths globally from inactivity, right? The shape and character of our cities is something that influences that number. This is big stuff. When it comes to environmental sustainability, you know, transportation now tops power generation as the top U.S. source of CO2 emissions, okay? So big banner headline stuff. We see an increase in issues around mental health, right? And that we know that people who are socially isolated have less mental health, have harder mental health issues, and that becomes a real public health issue. Happiness and well-being, as it turns out, is tied to how we spend our time and how we're able to spend our time. So they know that if you remove an hour from the commute, that's the equivalent happiness of a 40% pay increase, which is totally mind-blowing. Social equity and community cohesion, which we think about a lot, and actually I think we've done some really fun and interesting things here in West Palm Beach around this issue. We know that direct interpersonal contact between small-scale groups actually can reduce intergroup bias, and that's like a really complicated way of saying we just get along better if we're around each other more. I've been thinking a lot about loneliness, right? And I don't want to bring the room down, but loneliness is a problem that has been increasing in the country, right? And we've, you know, loneliness is as lethal as smoking 15 cigarettes per day. That's pretty heavy duty. People are talking about how social fragmentation is actually the core challenge of our time. It's really rough to think about it that way, but we live in a world where we see the impacts of social fragmentation. We long to be together, but we're apart. And so what does this have to do with us and all of us in this room is that we think that our challenge is to make places that foster and nurture human connection. We can talk about safety, right? Public safety, that's super important. But that's actually should be an outcome, perhaps, of a larger objective of fostering places that create human connection. And it's because, you know, as human beings, we have this desire to connect and shape and share experiences with one another. We also know that when people share experiences in public spaces, when people connect and create community, when places are transformed to invite new connections, and certainly West Palm Beach is an example for the rest of the world about creating places that invite new connections. When people discover new things about themselves and others, what they're doing is participating and actually creating public life, which is what we think of as what we all create when we live our lives outside of their homes and our businesses and our cars. And the interesting thing about this is it's not a silver bullet. But it turns out if you make places, cities, into places that support public life, you can start to tick off some of these big banner headline issues, right? A city that's more walkable and bikeable has better public health and public safety outcomes. A city that invites more people in and is vibrant, right, is a city that's better at attracting and retaining talent. Genuine, well-functioning public spaces are public spaces for everybody. And that's an equity conversation, right, which is super important. It's the thing that you can offer to everybody within a city. So we believe that public life, this is the thing that we've been caring about and studying for a long time, and it's the thing that's been driving a lot of the work that we've been doing together here in West Palm Beach, is the drive shaft of a great city. A lot of urban design firms will start with buildings and then shape the public spaces And then kind of like, if you build it, they will come, hope for public life. And what we think is that we need to understand what the shape and character of public life is, what kind of life do we want to make invitations for first, and then allow that to determine the strategy for space and public space management and public space design and ultimately development. That you kind of need to flip it on its head when you're thinking about cities. And we've definitely seen evidence, right? We've all been in lots of places that have been certainly well considered from a design perspective, but the people part of it all was sort of left alone, right? Don't worry about it, we'll just put more people in the renderings. We've definitely seen lots of renderings, tons of people, and then it gets built and they aren't there. And you might think in that case that we're actually not very good as human beings at designing for human beings, but it couldn't be further from the truth. Like, I love cars, actually. I don't own a car because of where I live. It's too expensive for me to do that, but I certainly love when I have the opportunity to drive a car or rent a car, I do that. And I'm astonished by how incredibly good human beings are at designing for human beings, right? So if you look at this car, you know, this is the progression. We have been steadily improving to the point where I get in a car these days and I put my hand on the steering wheel and there's actually a place for my pinky finger, right? Every aspect of it is designed intentionally and focused intentionally to be sweet and kind to the human body. And then the other part of this is that we've made the interior of the car so wonderful, and then we had to make the rest of the environment around it wonderful for the car, right? We are incredibly good at optimizing towards a specific outcome. And often when we optimize towards a specific outcome, we forget that we're working within a system, right? Like 50 years ago, we said we're going to go to the moon. We went to the moon. Unbelievable, right? We look at McDonald's, we said we wanted it to be cheaper, faster, and delicious. We nailed it, but it's not working so well in the system. We think about these iPhones, another example of how the smartest people in the world, when given a very specific idea and saying, I want you to make a thing that will capture everybody's attention as much as possible. And they 100% achieved it because human beings are really good at designing things for human beings. And so our question is really, what if we approached the way we think about our cities with the same intention, with that same care, and with that same thought? What if our objective in the city was, we want to create places that nurture and foster human connections with the same, like, laser-focused attention that we designed an iPhone, that we designed the interior of a car, that we went to the moon, yada, 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 right? The way that that works for us is that we really understand who our client is. The iPhone designers knew everything about the way the human brain works, right? The people that design the interior of a car, they know ergonomics, like they are so concerned and intentional about making something for a person. And so in our world, we know that our client, human beings, are slow, linear, horizontal, maximum 3-mile-per-hour walking creatures that have a great interest in other people, right? We also know that the human brain needs things. The human mind needs stimulation, like 1,000 per hour, which is about 1 per every 4 seconds, is the kind of stimulation that the human mind needs to feel alive and to feel good. We walk at about 3 miles per hour, all of us, and so when you walk down a really great street, it's interesting to note that at 3 miles per hour, 1 per every 4 seconds is about 20 to 24 feet. And so this feeling good on a street like this is in our biology, right? The other thing that we need to be aware of is that despite all of the cultural differences between us, there's so much about us that is the same. We're all more or less the same size, right? We all use our senses in the same way. We all walk at around the same speed. That thing that I talked about before, about the 1 per every 4 seconds, what's interesting, because we study this stuff, we know that this wall, which is the finest stone that money can buy, but it's a blank wall, people will walk past it faster and think that it takes longer. And so if you think about a city with blank concrete walls or empty parking lots, and we start to ask ourselves, why are people not walking from one place to another, and they're filled with those experiences? That's why. It's in our physiology, in our biology, to not want to be around that sort of that blank lack of richness. So we look at cities and we understand what the ground floor facade qualities are. We rank them from very active to inactive. We'll talk a little bit about what we have found here in West Palm Beach. But it helps us be specific about the reasons why things are working and why they're not. The other thing that we do is we talk deeply about public space quality. So every single one of you in this room is actually a public space quality expert, right? We all walk through our daily lives and we make little minute decisions all the time based on the inputs that we see. So it's hot down here, super sunny. If there's shade, you're going to move to the shade. We're just designed that way. If you're walking down a street and it's super dark there and you don't know too much about it, you're probably not going to go down the dark alley. If you're walking on a sidewalk and it starts to become kind of crumbled and broken up, you're probably going to move in a different direction. So we're all experts at this. And one of the things that we've done is boil down public space quality to these 12 criteria just to make it easier for us to talk about quality, right? So the top one is protection and safety. If you have a public space where people don't feel protected or safe, they won't go there. The second one is comfort, right? If you have a public space that's protected and safe but doesn't provide elements of comfort, people might go, but they won't stay very long at all. And then the third category is enjoyment and delight. And these are the elements within the city that land those memories that we just talked about earlier, right? And so wonderful places land themselves on the mental maps. For us, we're data-driven, right? And so we've been studying the way that people move through a space, move through public places all over the world for years. We think it's important that we measure what we care about. Engineers, they measure what they care about, and then they optimize around the measurements, right? And so we want to know how are people using a public space? And then because we're interested in inviting more people to stay in a public space, that's the thing that makes it vibrant. We want to know what they're doing when they've made the decision to stay. So we'll actually get, we did this here in West Palm Beach, an army of volunteers to go out and observe with their eyes and count the number of people in a place and look at what they're doing and see who is there. Because the only way to improve a place is to actually know what's going on in the first place. The other thing I'll note is that observation and getting out in the world is actually really incredible. It's really important. Like, I would love for the next time we talked for all of us to actually go out and walk and listen and learn and smell and hear all of this together. This person right here in a conventional planning process is a dot on a map and is referred to as a pedestrian, which is kind of an abstract term, right? And being there with this person means that you smell the cars, you feel the anxiety, you hear the noise, and it changes the way that you think, that we all think about decision making when it comes to providing for human beings in the public realm. For us, it's about learning how people actually behave instead of how we think they behave. A lot of planning is predicated on an assumption of behavior instead of actual knowledge of behavior. We've just come out with this new book, which I think would be, we could share some copies with you. I just realized I probably shouldn't be pitching a book in front of the commission, but the point about this is that we think that thinking about the city as a soft city, so much of the city is hard and fixed, and actually really great places are a bit softer and more flexible and are designed to, again, accommodate people and the interfaces and daily moves that people make. The soft city is about moving closer, getting together, and connecting people to one another, to everyday aspects of life. I'm going to burn through some of this because I'm probably going over time. This is a city that thinks about the public spaces, the streets, the plazas, the parks, as dynamic environments that are for everybody. The 21st century street is a street that's used for all kinds of things, not just movement, right? And we have examples of how that's working here. When we recognize the soft city, it's not complicated stuff, right? It's about providing seating when somebody's tired. This is a project in Sao Paulo that we did, and we called these women with their dog an indicator species. They were actually in a plaza that was completely overcome by drug dealing and violence, and when they put this project in, it changed the dynamic of the space. And when we saw people with their dogs in there, we knew that things had changed, right? This is the indicative species of change in a place like this. Little moments like this is just, there was a dance class and they put a window on the street so that people could watch in, right? Those parts of the city that connect us to one another. This is a table in a restaurant that's kind of all over the Northeast now, and one of the like dramatic innovations that they did was to put a communal table in, right? Pretty funny, but that's what it is, and that's a really important, simple thing to do. I like this one because it has nothing to do with people. This is the way that the cats get into the, these like little elements of care and thought, right? This is another soft city thing. This is in Melbourne, Australia, where The bars closed at like 2 a.m. and they were having this issue where like these guys would come out and be brawling with each other. They'd be drunk and they'd be like showing off for their girlfriends. And so Rob Adams said, "All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put a flower shop in there. We're going to give them a great deal, but they have to stay open all night." And what happened was that all the brawling went down after the flower shop went in, because he believes it's because these guys came out with their macho thing and instead bought flowers for their girlfriends instead of fighting with each other. But these like little things actually that don't seem so big but actually make a huge impact on the way a place feels. So Gal in West Palm Beach, we've been hanging out with you guys here for a few years now. And it started with some really fun tactical things that we did with the DDA. I'm not going to get into super detail. But we started to introduce the idea about collecting and observing public life data within the place. In May 2016, we did a citywide public space, public life survey and looked at multiple neighborhoods and their adjacent connections to downtown. We released the Public Realm Action Plan, which I'll share some highlights to. The other thing that we talked about in the city of West Palm Beach is that in places where this stuff works really well, you actually have to change a little bit the way that you work inside City Hall. And so that started this pretty amazing experiment of creating an Office of Public Life, which was the first one in the country, and I run around the country telling everybody that this was the first place that ever did it. My CEO was just in Singapore, actually, talking about West Palm Beach because of this idea. We know it's an idea in evolution, but the point of it is that having an entity or a person that can look across the agencies, right? Because the Department of Transportation has very specific goals and parameters. Economic development, same. Parks and Rec, same. When you want to create a place that supports public life, you kind of need to think of it as an umbrella, and it's working well in those places. One of the first projects out of the gate for the Office of Public Life actually was this amazing pilot project in the Northwest neighborhood, which we'll share a little bit more about in a minute. But I'll just say it's been super exciting to watch a process like this unfold and to be involved in this way. So taking stock of public space and public life in West Palm Beach, these are just excerpts from the Public Realm Action Plan. You know, we looked at pretty significant parts of West Palm Beach when we did this. As I said before, we asked an army of volunteers to fan out and really study the place. We also did a lot of civic engagement. So we asked Palm Beachers, what do you value in public spaces? And it's natural beauty and greenery, liveliness and fun, sociability, comfortable microclimate, walkability and accessibility. And so some of the key takeaways from this process were we recognize that quality invites quantity, which is that the high quality spaces and places in West Palm Beach actually invite more people in, and we can show that through the data. We found of the places that we looked at, there were basically like 3 or 4 spots in the city where quality layered up, where you had shade, active facades, good lighting, and programming and activation and seating. These 3 places 100% correlated with activity. So the more, you can see it here. So these are graphs that show the level of activity in these places. And you know, City Place, Clematis East and West, those are the places that have significantly more people in them. And it's because they're high quality places. This is what we call stationary activity mapping. You know, the most favorite places were the Plaza at City Place and then Clematis down by the waterfront. The other thing that we saw is that it's a compact city. It takes 20 minutes to get from one side of the city to the other walking. That's extraordinary. But nobody's doing it because it's actually quite fragmented, right? You get a stretch of a block and a half of good, and then it's broken up by another block and a half of not so good. And so that's something that we can fix. These are the things that we see in the places where people aren't walking, right? There's just obstructions. And by the way, this is a common issue. It's not just West Palm Beach. We see this all over the world. But we also see that when people feel invited, you get, 1,000 people an hour. Like, that's heavy duty. That's really good volume. That's really good public life. The other thing that we see is that there are reasons to go but not to stay. So there's been a lot of investment in public art, amazing public art in the city. And what we saw is that people would come there, but because the opportunity for comfort wasn't provided, people were not staying. So it's this idea of layering in comfort now. You did the art, you got the places, now we layer in more and make these places that are for people to stay. So we say, look, but don't stay, actually. I'm going to burn through this. It's a city ready for a transition. Nobody here is suggesting that the city of West Palm Beach needs to be without cars at all. What we're suggesting is that it could be a city that actually provides more options. We don't have to give up our automobility to also provide walkability and bikeability. And so, I'm not telling anybody anything new, but there are some connector streets that actually become divider streets because they're so wide, right? And you see, and when that happens, you see things like this, right? Where people are trying to get across a very wide street and need a little help. It could take nearly 11 minutes to cross Okeechobee given the light timing. And when you think about having a convention that wants to get to Rosemary Square, we should probably figure out a way to fix that. It's pretty simple stuff because we want to get all those people to come in and eat all that food. It's a city of neighborhoods with different public space experiences, right? We all know this, that some neighborhoods have really wonderful experiences and other neighborhoods are not feeling that yet. And part of the Rosemary project, actually, the Northwest project, was to start to think about ways to shift that imbalance if we do want to be a city for everybody. Parks provide an incredible mix of activities, but for the number of parks that are there, we actually think the usage could be much better, right? And so one of the ways to know that is to just measure it and see who's there. Can we get these numbers up? Can we decide that we're going to do that? So we set a vision for the public realm with strategies and tactics to get there. These are some highlights, right? We want to prioritize comfortable connections. So whenever we're investing in a place whenever we're investing in streets or any kind of infrastructure, we hope that investment is also about making a connection that's more comfortable than it was before, right? We want to focus and create extreme quality places. So there's so much excitement and energy around doing lots and lots of things across the city of West Palm Beach, but it might be good to pick 2 or 3 and really focus down and make those things extraordinary and then move on to the next one. I think one of the things we see in cities is that ambition is great, but spreading thin actually doesn't work. And so it's hard politically to pick, but it would be great to prioritize and pick to make something wonderful. Embrace and dignify human scale mobility. Fill in the gaps on the streetscape, right? The planning department is working hard to make sure that the development that's happening in the city is actually going to generate that 1 per every 4 seconds thing rather than a blank wall, right? Super important stuff. Ensure equitable access to great places. So it isn't about just making the right place good, it's about making sure you can get to it more easily, right? And not having to cross a giant 4-lane highway terrified, right, would be something to work towards. We also was like, look, you're West Palm Beach, the water is there, it's extraordinary. When we surveyed people, most people said one of their favorite places was the waterfront. So how do we help people get to the waterfront equitably? And then let public life data drive design. So if we're going to be really focused about it, we need to actually measure what our success is and then hold ourselves accountable to those measurements and promote authentic community engagement. So, we came up with this series of ideas a few years ago about doing pilot projects to help the city embark upon this and learn from this. The one that was picked was Dance into the Sunset, which was this idea about creating connections from downtown up to the Sunset Lounge. I'm going to share a little bit about what's happened here. We were not involved in all of these things, but we think we think a lot of these projects are actually about building a place that supports public life. And so it's sort of with pride that we see all of these things happening. Citywide lighting improvements, a mobility plan, greenway multipurpose paths. Lots of people are working very hard to commit themselves to this bigger idea, which is wonderful. We just got the data in from the 300 block in Clematis. This totally blew me away, but a year ago, you'd see 470,000 total visitors, around 6,000 on a Saturday average. A typical day is 4,000. The Clematis block goes in, and now you see 10,000 on Saturday, 777,000 total visitors across the year. That's total evidence, right, that these kinds of investments are making a change. And it's not just the streetscape. We know that there's been effort to activate that block with retail and all the other things, but it's all part of the same picture, right, that we're actually making a difference. We talked about the Office of Public Life. I'm going to burn through that. We were involved in Rosemary. We're seeing Rosemary being significantly transformed down at City Place. But then what's totally interesting to us and what makes this story really great is that it's not just at City Place, that you guys are thinking about Rosemary all the way to the Sunset Lounge. For a conversation right now in the country about equity and thinking about investing so that everybody has access to it, this mile is actually this incredible story to tell, right? Where coinciding with the investment at City Place, we're seeing investment now up on the north end. It's a really extraordinary story. And Kate's going to talk a little bit about that story, and hopefully we're not totally wildly over time.
So for the past almost year, we have been working with you guys. A lot of different groups have contributed to create a public space in the historic Northwest. We set out to really create a place for the community to gather. We had gotten some feedback from previous events that there wasn't a space that the community could come together or a space they could use for themselves. And in the process, we also wanted to start to create a new cycle of feedback where we responded to what we heard the community wanted and needed. It's been really amazing, but simple space that's gone up. We've gotten contributions from the DDA in the Taylor Moxie Library that's there. We've gotten the construction company that's working on the Sunset Lounge to contribute materials and time and build. A lot of sweat equity from people at the city have gone in to put this space into the ground. But it's also been amazing to watch the community come out and take ownership over this space and begin to just use it as their own platform. Thank you, Armando. One of the things we learned early on, we held a workshop and we just didn't get a lot of people to come out, and we were trying to think about how we could engage more people and have more voices heard. And we created a survey and then asked some community members from the American Legion to go out and go door to door and ask for people to participate. And so we reached 125 households from that survey. And it was really a breakthrough for the project to figure out, like, what did we need to do to actually reach the community members and speak in a way that they understood and could respond. Also, in the process of the 10 months, the community has just come out and stepped up to contribute with stewardship of the project and to help build it. On a weekend event, Wendy actually was out building these pieces of the stage, and some of the kids that were there offered to paint as well. And then the next week they came back with equipment to paint it faster and better and taught other kids in the community how they could use that equipment. Additionally, I think for the last maybe 8 months, various neighbors of the space have been opening and closing the library every day for the community to use. And in a transient community, to have that stability of coming every day to open and close this space for others has been really amazing. We heard also that the community wanted events to take place, and so we hosted, with the city, hosted 4 events, and over 300 people came out. But then the community asked to host events, and they actually started to take ownership of the space, and they since have hosted 12 events that often get over 300 people in a single event that happens. So that, and it's also been amazing that there's been a family reunion on the space. There's been an Easter egg hunt. There's been a group come with a culinary tour to see the space. Every 4th Friday, the community hosts a networking event and invites local businesses out to the space to network with each other and kind of create opportunity. That often looks like this, a lot of fun. This latest edition here in the bottom right corner is a serving container that allows people to, right now it acts as a bar, but also 3 or 4 local people that cook out of their home right now as their business want to come serve lunch on the space on a daily basis. And I've asked to be able to do that, which is this amazing thing that, like, the space in the community is creating opportunity for people to improve their own lives and also pursue things they're passionate about. Again, when we have events on the space, we ask people to fill out a little survey. What do you like? What do you want more of? What can we do? And then we do that. And as a result, we've created a more positive feedback cycle with them, and this way that they know just to reach out to Wendy. They can ask for things. We also have a platform once a month or twice a month that we can share with them updates about the neighborhood. And there's over 300 people to tell, and they tell their friends, and they tell their neighbors. And we've just expanded the communication that we have with this group of people in this community. It's also, in the 10 months that it's been open, there have been maybe a handful of things that have been broken or vandalized. And I think it's really just challenged the stigma that we couldn't give anything to this community. And they've really made this space their own. And it's been a really great way to get the community excited about the longer-term capital investment that's coming. There's a lot of amazing things planned in the neighborhood, from Rosemary Ave, from the Sunset Lounge, from a new park, And in this way, in engaging the community and giving them this space to activate themselves, we hope that that can also translate to the park when it comes online. And they will already have this muscle built of how do we use this park? What can we do with this space? How can it help us? So we are just getting ready to start off another phase of work, and we hope that we can learn from this first phase about making this a more everyday destination that people spend time in, that they know it's there for them, and then we can continue building this cycle of community-driven engagement where we listen to how how to communicate with them and meet them where they are. So we have a couple things planned. At the core, we're going to invite a group of community leaders that hopefully maybe are growing businesses themselves and empower them, give them some skill building, and then let them have the space and some money to host an event themselves and hopefully build some awareness for their project and their space. We also want to make some iterations on the design of the site to learn more about what the community wants in the neighborhood, and then document all of this so that this can be a process that we can use in other neighborhoods and think about how we can influence the conversation that you guys are having with other neighborhoods across the city. So we'll end with this quote that is part of the new Soft City book that we just released. But a society can be stone hard that it fuses into a block. A people can be so bone hard that life goes into shock. And the heart is all in shadow, and the heart has almost stopped, till some begin to build a city as soft as a body. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioners? Is this on? Yeah. Any questions, observations? Will we be updating some of the findings, or we're just operating under the assumption that the findings we did, because those studies was done, what, 2017? Yeah. So we're in 2019 now.
Yeah, so I think the cities that are doing this well will continue to measure, right? And I think it would be great, you know, as a function perhaps of Wendy's role or others, to keep measuring so that we know what's working and what's not. You know, I think at Rosemary Square, they're going to be starting to measure to see what's happening there as the construction finishes. It was pretty extraordinary to hear the data come out of Clematis. There, you know, there's a bunch of data that's coming out of the Northwest neighborhood where we're able to say we have significant increases in people that are going there. We're starting to get anecdotal information about new relationships being made, but I think that it's super important to keep measuring and continue to update.
One of the things I'd like help on is messaging. We have, and you alluded to it, we have a city that's in transition. West Palm Beach has been very car-oriented for years. And now we are trying to make that transition to, at least in certain parts of the city, to make it more walkable, more bikeable. I think the message has to get out that those two goals are not inconsistent. To have a city that's more walkable, more pedestrian-friendly, that's more bike-friendly, does not mean we're getting rid of cars. We're not going into people's homes and taking away keys. So I think we need help in messaging. Have there been any other communities, particularly in the southeast, that have undergone this transition that we might look to for messaging help?
I'd have to go back and look to see communities in the southeast. I mean, look, the progressive cities in the United States are all going through this right now, right? And I think it's challenging because we're talking about a multi-generational shift, perhaps, and it's, you know, I don't think it serves the argument well, as you just said, to suggest that we need to live without our cars. I think what we have seen is that people go through mindset shift when they experience things themselves, right? And so in some of the cities that we've worked, you know, there's you've probably done this here, where they have open streets or they have events where portions of the street at times of the day are shut down just to experience what it's like to go from one side of the city to the other on a bike. And I think more and more people that have those experiences starts to develop a broader constituency for change. But the other side of it, and this is where I think sometimes a movement gets in the way of the actual progress, is that we still need to have real empathy for people that are experiencing change, right? That in my work, I feel like having empathy for the fears that people feel when change comes is a much better approach than kind of like beating people over the head with a stick that this has to happen. So we can go and look for other examples in the Southeast. I think that's a great question.
Well, I asked primarily because of our unique climate issues.
Yeah.
You know, during the summertime, it gets very,
very
very
hot.
hot here.
Yeah.
And that's something that's thrown at us. The other difficulty we have is sometimes people just don't get it. I mean, we went through a whole discussion just a few weeks ago about just putting in some bike lanes on a portion of our city, but they had some fairly affluent individuals who were in opposition to it. We had a disaster of a rollout of something was called Flagler Shore, and folks were just up in arms.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm looking for help in how we can modify, refine the messaging of what we're trying to do, so that we don't have these pitchforks and knives battles.
Yeah, I think one thing is to look for we're always interested in finding low-hanging fruit and quick wins, and so, you know, if there's a piece of the city that is against something, are there other parts of the city that are looking for it? And are those the places that we can focus on in the near term so that you can get something in? The other thing is that, you know, this is why testing and piloting seems so important, because you can try something out for not very much investment and then listen to what people are saying about it. And when that moment happens where you try something and you listen and it doesn't work and then you change it, there's a new moment of trust, I think, that gets built into the system, which is, I think, what's happening on the historic Northwest. And so with the bike lane issue, I think, you know, trying in places where people are asking for it first might be a good place to start.
Commissioner Shove.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for your presentation. Certainly some great wins, and thank you to Commissioner Nearing, the mayor, for their foresight on previous commissions. And I think something that you said was kind of touching on what my thoughts were. I think there's some really great projects. I see a lot of historic Northwest. I see a lot of downtown, and we're talking about 20 minutes to walk from one end of the city to the other, but that's really one end of the downtown to the other.
Yep.
You know, we have a lot of areas in the north end. We have a lot in the south end on Antique Row, and even some out towards our western communities and into you know, District 2 that I think, as we look, it's challenging, right? You can either do a little with a lot or a lot with a little. And so when you start to spread those efforts out, you need to make sure they don't get diluted. And perhaps we have that opportunity to concentrate those efforts, but just throughout the city, so that, you know, I think there's some great takeaways here. Some I know certainly I'd welcome in the north end, I'm sure in the south end, and other district commissioners would be happy to take a look at. So if we can start to take a look at how can we implement some of these things, and I think it helps to the mayor's point of the communication. If it's only happening in the downtown and I don't see it outside my community, then I don't know about it. Whereas if I have something to point to that says this happened on Northwood Road, this happened on Antique Row, this happened out in the villages, this happened in Ibis, you know, wherever we may be, then it gives me something to point to and helps with that messaging. So thank you.
So just to Commissioner Shove's point, and also to address some of the things the mayor mentioned, we are doing, for this coming fiscal year, we're going to be focusing on, I don't know if you saw really quickly up there, they mentioned 2-minute Tamarin. So a variation of that, which would be north of Palm Beach Lakes Boulevard along Tamarin, we're going to look at doing economic development, engaging that street, that Tamarin Avenue historic commercial corridor, and trying some commercial pilot programs there for this coming fiscal year, and we budgeted for that, and Wendy will be leading that effort. So that's one opportunity, I think, to address what you're talking about, as is also with the RISE initiative. I think there'll be opportunities there as well with different pilot projects that we can look at addressing in the north end. And of course, the south end, I think there's a lot of opportunities down there, especially if we get the golf course thing going in the very south part of the city. We can do a lot of different opportunities there, I think, to do some pilot programs and engage some folks as well.
Madam President.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation. And, you know, I found myself thinking about what you were saying about activity along the street and when you walk somewhere, because you're right. When we go and visit San Francisco, Boston, New York, it's no problem. We will literally walk for miles and not even think twice about it. But around here, and in most places in Florida, that's not really standard. But what really caught my attention was the slides that you had about the community input and the community feedback. And, you know, I hope that that's something that we're able to carry on to other projects, and maybe, you know, there's lessons learned. I'm sure there was quite an investment to be able to do that, but maybe there's other ways that we can implement that in other projects, because I think it was profound for you to share with us that the community is asking for even more of this now. They're taking ownership. They're opening and closing the library. They own this, and I think that's really fabulous.
I think a broader question, Commissioners, is whether this is a path that you want us to continue upon. Do you need more information? It is, in my view, it is an evolving landscape. So we welcome your input, you know, as to the future of this. I don't want you to think it's etched in stone and that it's take it or leave it. This is really something that, you know, we will weigh in on as to whether it's something we want to continue or modify or tweak. Yes, Commissioner Schoaf.
Thank you. I certainly think there have been some good wins here, and I personally, as part of this dais, would like to see us expand in a way that makes sense for us. Again, I don't want our efforts to be diluted. We have a big city. I realize we can't cover all areas at once, but I think, you know, what I see are a lot of great concentrated efforts within the downtown and the Northwest, and I think all of those projects, as demonstrated, have some really great merit. I'd like to see some concentration of effort in some of our other districts and things that make sense, again, so that we don't dilute the whole program. So I'm supportive of moving forward.
Mayor, if I could, I mean, one of the things that we're looking at in terms of evolving how we look at this is that engagement piece. So that was a lot of discussion here about that. So having more robust citizen and community engagement will be, you know, part of this effort with your direction, of course. But that's something that we want to really do, is to concentrate on not just providing these pilot programs and making sure we're engaging the community in these programs and getting that feedback and ensuring that we're doing what the neighborhood really is asking for.
Okay.
Just briefly, too, I want to say that I think if you think about it in terms of what Matthew said earlier about an umbrella, that it kind of can be we can use it for all the projects we're doing. And I think the 31st to 35th Street utility project is a classic example of that, where, you know, when you do a utility project, they don't really have the money to do above-ground interventions, but we have other monies in way of tree mitigation funds that when we're looking at a project holistically to see where we can have an impact on public life, we were able to do the trees. And then the community engagement. I mean, I literally walked door to door and had conversations with everybody on those streets about what trees they would like to see and how many they would like to see. So I think there's a way also that where we have projects already going, that we can weave this into those projects.
Good. Commissioner Schoaf.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, and while certainly appreciative of enhancing projects that are going on with trees and looking forward to the future, what I would like to see more of are things, you know, I think there's a distinct difference between recreating an entire space, opening a Taylor Moxie library, and just improving what I think already the expectation is. So, you know, those are the things I'd like to see us concentrate our efforts on, or something that we can point to say, here was a distinct improvement to public life. Not that, I mean, all of these things are very important, you know, but I think the residents kind of expect a level. If you're replacing a street, you're replacing the lights, you're replacing the trees, which, again, I understand has a funding mechanism behind it and doesn't always work out, and so appreciative of being able to take those resources and put them together. But the direction that I would like to see is to try to make sure we have something distinctly different to point to, not, you know, I think what neighbors would look at as kind of the status quo.
Well, in closing this particular item, Commissioners, keep this in mind as we enter into some of our strategic planning discussions in a couple of months. You know, bookmark this as something that we might want to consider, and how that could be folded into some of what our strategic priorities might be during that discussion. All right. Thank you very much. Very good presentation. Any other questions? Okay. Item 2, development of 401 Datura Street. Mr. Green?
Thank you, Mayor. Rick Green, Assistant City Administrator. Anna's going to do a presentation, but what I want to put a few thoughts in your head. We're talking about the property at 401 Datura Street, which is directly behind us, behind the Clematis Street front. It's the parking lot north of Broadstone City Center. Historically, it's been referred to as Parking Lot B. We have been engaged with a group that's looking to develop that as an assisted living facility, primarily independent units on that site. And the city owned this property a while ago, and when we owned the property, we eventually sold it to a gentleman named Nadir Salor, who built Lofton Place. There were 3 conditions that the city attached to the redevelopment of this property. 1, that a cultural use be provided. 2, that a pharmacy be built as part of the project. And 3, that 50 public parking spaces be provided. The city got rid of the cultural use requirement. The other 2 conditions still remain. We don't think with the CVS going in right on Clematis Street, right adjacent to the site, that that's required. But the city was still very desirous of the 50 public parking spaces, given the limited amount of parking right there for the businesses on Clematis. At the same time, we were also doing trash pickup for those uses on this property. So we think we've developed and worked with the development group, and they're here today for a very creative solution, but we need your direction because they have to finalize their architectural plans for submittal to go through the entitlement process and building permitting. So we just want to run this scenario by you to make sure you're on the same track, and with that, I'll turn it over to Anna.
As Mr. Green said, so the property is on the north side of Datura between Quadro and Dixie Highway, all the way to the alley. It's currently occupied by the surface parking lot, approximately 140 spaces. It was originally owned by the city, and it was sold. In 2002, the city issued an RFP for the redevelopment of the parking lot B, with a minimum criteria that included that the project had to be a housing project, included a pharmacy, and also included some parking spaces for the public to replace the surface parking that was in there. In 2003, on February 18, the city actually accepted the proposal submitted by Cypress Realty and authorized the negotiation of the purchase and sale agreement and the development agreement with the developer. In 2004, the city entered into the agreement with the developer, and a restrictive covenant was imposed. The project was basically included, at that time, the developer proposed to do an 8 to 10-story building, mixed use with residential, included the parking requirement as required by the city, and included a cultural space and a pharmacy on the property. Of course, the project didn't move forward. Since 2004, the project has maintained the surface parking that is in there. Right now, the property was sold afterward to a new developer. Other projects had been approved on the site, but none has moved forward. At this point, we have some development that is under contract with the current property owner. But the bulk of the discussion today is the restrictive covenant that was imposed in 2004 as part of the purchase and sale agreement included specific points. The building had to be developed with a minimum of 5 stories. The upper floors had to be reserved for residential uses. The project had to include a pharmacy on the ground floor, which no less than 1,500 square feet in size, and then included 50 parking spaces that had to be open to the public, located on the basement or the ground floor of the parking garage. The rates had to be determined by the city, and the revenue belonged to the city after that, and also included some requirements for the signage on the building. So also included a provision that says that no modifications or amendment to this restrictive covenant could be done without the city commission approval, and that's the reason why we are here in front of you. The new developer wants to modify these requirements, and we need direction from the city commission of how to proceed with this. As I mentioned, the SUM development has the site under contract and has already submitted for site plan approval. It's an independent living and also an assisted living facility. 8 stories, has 100 units for independent living, 36 assisted living units, and 20 for memory care units. The project is designed as a fully valet service, so the public will not be able to access directly the garage, but all the residents and guests for this building will have to basically use a valet service that has direct entrance from the alley.
Hold on, and Commissioner Schoaf, you had a question?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just not familiar with the levels of living units. Can you give us a brief, or someone give us a brief breakdown of what each one of those actually means?
Yes, the independent living are basically regular units, like apartments, but they are restricted on age. So I think it's 55 and above, they're rentals. So it's like a regular residential building. Then the other part that is assisted living facilities is for patients that are somehow limited, but they need, they are still some independency, but they still need some assistance. So they are not separate units. They live in units but have common area where they can eat, and they have some assistance for their care. And then the memory care units are more restricted, are patients that are not self-sufficient, and they need basically assistance 24 hours.
Generally, you start with assisted living, and then you migrate into memory care. My father went through the same thing.
So when you get to the point of memory care, you're requiring full-time medical staff?
Pretty much, yes.
Of which will not reside at this building?
They would be working there, not necessarily living there,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
So what we want to go is all the conditions of the restrictive covenants to determine how do you want us to proceed with this negotiation. Based on the 5 restrictions, we have basically some of them that are already in compliance. The building, it will be 8 stories, so it's in compliance with the restrictive covenant. It's a residential building, so they are also in compliance with that. We believe the pharmacy that was originally required, basically the developer is proposing to remove it. The CVS is being constructed across the street, so we don't think it's worth it to impose this condition any longer on the project. So the applicant is proposing to remove that condition, and staff totally supports that. And the last one, I'm going to skip over the parking, but the last one is regarding the signage. We believe the signage can be regulated by the current signage regulations of the downtown master plan, so we don't need any addition of a special provision for this. So in reality, the only restriction in the restrictive covenant that has outstanding issues right now is regarding the 50 parking spaces that was required to be open to the general public, located in the basement level or ground floor of the building parking garage, the rates to be determined by the city, and the revenue shall belong to the city. This is the language that was included in the restrictive covenant. So staff is looking direction from the city commission if you want us to basically proceed and negotiate some modification of this regulation with the applicant. At this point, the applicant is proposing for compliance with the requirements to, 1, provide an enclosed and secure air conditioning room for garbage and compactor recycling container in the alley that it has been derived from discussions with the staff of the need that the city has. The price of construction for the dumpster area plus maintenance is equivalent to the 18 parking spaces. They are also proposing 5 parking spaces located on the property but accessible from the alley. And 12 additional parking spaces will be proposed in the garage, operated and managed by the developer to be functioning as part of the valet service. The remaining of the spaces, there are 15 spaces, the applicant is proposing to pay into the parking fund the remaining of the spaces. And of course, they are proposing to remove the pharmacy from the restrictions. So staff generally supports modifying the 50 spaces to basically make the project viable and adapted to the current conditions. We have discussed the proposal for the trash compactor is originated from a request by staff because of the current conditions. So we support continuing to negotiate this part. And the reason for that is we have, the city has currently the trash compactors located on that property. So if the project moves ahead without this, we'll have to find another location for the trash compactors. And it's difficult on that side. All the properties on the north side are kind of tied, and it will be difficult to find it. So the new project gives the opportunity to work with the developer and find a more appropriate location within their site and put better conditions for that.
Yeah, let me add, Anna. So what that means is the compactor would be integrated into the design of the building. So it would be an air-conditioned space that would be accessed by the businesses on Clematis with a swipe card. So it's kind of unique in the sense that it would be an enclosed building and be contained as part of the structure.
So it would still be available to the other businesses in the 400 block?
Yes,
Correct.
definitely. It will be the compactors for all the businesses in the 500 block, but it will be a much better facility that we currently have on that block. It will be air conditioner, secure also, so the issues that we have with people dumping the stuff next to the compactors that will not have, it will be a secure card. And the developer is offering to basically manage it and maintain it clean and operated. So staff is in support of this. Exactly what is the equivalent of how many parking spaces that equates, which we'll have to run those numbers and negotiate and go over. But in general, the principle of replacing some of the requirement for parking spaces for the provision of the parking, some of the parking spaces for the provision of the dumpster or the compactors area, it's a good option. In addition to that, we think it's a good option to modify the exact requirement of asking for the 50 spaces on the site, on the parking garage, because of the conditions, particular conditions of the project. In general, staff would like to try to maintain as many parking spaces on site as possible. So we have worked with them on the site plan to be able to accommodate 5 parking spaces that are accessible from the alley, close to the Dixie side. Those spaces will be metered, so will be for the general public, so we'll be kind of trying to replace the easy availability of the parking spaces that are right now on the site. The additional spaces, we have been discussing with the applicant to provide some of the spaces through the same valet parking that they have. At this point, they have offered 12 spaces on that system. They are suggesting the parking spaces will be operated and managed by them. Staff is suggesting that the parking spaces will have to still be available to purchase by the public through the city pool system. So when somebody is looking for a space in the parking garages, so they could go, so the parking administrator knows that there are 5 spaces in this building available. Because if not, nobody will know that there are parking spaces available in that garage. So it will have to be kind of somehow coordinated, the availability of those spaces through the parking administrator.
How will the city receive revenue from that? I mean, are they metered or?
They are not metered. They will have to be basically a monthly passes. So we are expecting, the way we're imagining this at this point is you buy a monthly pass.
Okay.
The same way you buy it in the city garage, you will buy it in this garage. It will have a
So
price.
it's not somebody just coming out for the evening to go to a restaurant and.
No,
wanting-
it will have
okay,
to be
okay.
the monthly passes.
We suspect it'll be somebody who needs parking on a regular basis,
Okay.
so they'll contract through Mr. Davis and get a
Yeah.
monthly pass.
And then the other point is that the revenue from these parking spaces will have to come back to the city as it was the provision of the original requirement. Again, the details for how this is gonna work and operate, we haven't reached that point yet, but that is kind of the initial concept. Then the third one, the applicant is proposing the remainder of the space to be basically paying to the fund. Staff is suggesting at this point that we would like to start a negotiation where instead of paying a lump sum and to buy out the space, we negotiate a monthly or annual fee that they have to pay for the rest of the existence of the project as a contribution, and we were thinking that could be directed to the trolley operations instead of just regular buyout of the spaces. Again, the exact number and the equivalency of the rates and all that, we have not reached that point, but we wanted to get direction from Commission if you think we can go ahead and sit down with the developer and negotiate some terms of how this could happen. We are in support of removing the pharmacy, and that will be one item that we don't think is controversial. That is all I have to say right now. The applicant, of course, is here.
Madam President and Commissioner Neary?
Thank you.
The applicant? Oh, okay, hello.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Anna, for the presentation. I have a few questions relating to the history of this. And first, just so I can get a sense of, what year was it that these provisions were set in place?
2004.
Yes,
2004.
2004, okay. So I think it's important for us to, thank you, there it is, to understand, what was the climate then that necessitated putting this 50 space requirement? And has anything changed that would allow us more flexibility now? And one of those things might be, because you mentioned them offering to pay into a fund instead, and maybe we didn't have that fund at the time. So that's kind of the gist of my question, is about the history and what has changed. And then just a follow-up on this as well is, have you talked to the merchants in the surrounding area about this?
We have not. We have not talked about the removal of the parking. I mean, this was approved by the City Commission in 2004, so the expectation was this parking lot as it exists right now will go away eventually. I mean, I'm sure the city wanted it to happen much earlier. So we are at this point, we're 2017 and we don't have a project yet. But the agreement was 50 spaces. And I mean, I was not here when that happened. What we understand is the desire for the city to still maintain at least 50 spaces on site. The purchase price, we understand, it was reduced for those conditions that were imposed, and that's why we would like to maintain somehow some of the space on the site and negotiate something with the developer.
And if you go back to the aerial, Anna, you'll see that, before the CVS space was occupied by Ultimate Gym, the majority of the folks that were using that gym were parking in parking lot B. So I think the demand still exists today, because when the CVS comes in, again, they're going to be limited in where they can park. The 5 metered spaces that Anna referenced, as she mentioned, is along the Dixie side, but it is just south of the CVS. So we see that as an opportunity for people to park directly behind the CVS, walk up Dixie to the store itself. But it's on the northeast corner, if you will, of the parking lot.
Yeah,
So
I mean, the current site plan is proposing some of the parking spaces on this side, the 5 parking spaces that will be open to the public with easy access from the alley in here. So those will be the ones that will be available on a meter, just quick run. The rest of the spaces, some of them will be inside the garage and will be available only as a monthly lease. And then the rest of the remaining 12 spaces that they say they cannot accommodate in the site, we are proposing to get a monthly contribution to the trolley fund instead of just a simple buyout of the spaces. The developer would like to just do the buyout.
And you see the challenges on the sanitation pickup, because a lot of the buildings run from Clematis Street directly to the alley. There's an alley that runs through there. So there's very little space in some of the businesses to locate an actual dumpster. So we thought this would be a good compromise as well.
Commissioner Neary?
Thank you, Mayor. So I think, given that the restrictive covenants, we're talking 2004, obviously things have changed, so I agree with the Commissioner. But if I look at what we put in place, or what that administration and commission put in place, there is, of all of those items, there is one item that we still continue to talk about in this city, whether it's perception or the reality, and that's parking. So I think a pass on the pharmacy, obviously, with CVS going in, that makes a lot of sense. There was another issue in terms of the restrictive covenant that just is a no-brainer. But again, to me, as I'm out and conversing with residents and business owners, parking still, again, whether it's perception or reality, still is a hot button issue. So I want to just say that. Secondly, so we would be, as I understand it, currently 140 spaces.
Yes.
The restrictive covenant is 50, and I realize that's why we're here now to talk through this, but I'm counting maybe 17, 5-meter parking and 12 valet is kind of on the table, both from the developer and the staff input around this?
Yes, right now the proposal is the dumpster or compactor will equate to approximately 18 spaces.
Can you go to that slide? Can you pull that slide?
Yes. That slide is...
And what we did there is we looked at the developer provided us the cost to build the enclosed structure for the garage, and we identified that cost and divided by the cost to offset by buying out a parking space.
Yeah, so the parking, the garage or dumpster will equate to 18 spaces. That's what the applicant is proposing. Then there will be 5 spaces on the alley available as a meter spaces, and then 12 as valet inside the garage. The remaining 15 are the ones that they are proposing to buyout and the payment in lieu system.
All right, so I appreciate that we're bringing this, and I don't know that I don't have an answer today other than to say, you know, again, one of the issues along with some of the other ones that are obviously being addressed in terms of downtown core that I hear is parking, again, whether that's a reality or not. And so I think if you go to the staff's proposal, if you can move to that last slide, I think it was the last slide or right there. So, you know, I would be in support of maintaining as many parking spaces as possible for the general public. Whatever that is, obviously, this is the first step in a longer process. But, you know, I would be in favor of that. Again, going back to 2004, conditions do change. I think I heard someone say that this parcel was purchased with those restrictive covenants. I mean, they knew, you know, folks knew what they were getting into. And again, to me, of all of the restrictive covenants, the one that is maintained, at least in my eyes, from 2004 to soon to be 2020 is parking. So,
Hey, we might want to bookmark that concern because our next presentation will be talking about parking. So there may be some insights there that could help on that particular issue. Commissioner Shove?
Thank you, Mayor. Two things I wanted to ask back to 2004 on the pharmacy, and I don't know if this information is available. What was the reasoning behind putting that restrictive covenant on that property at the time? So I guess where I'm taking this is CVS is going in now. That's great, but CVS comes in, building goes up, CVS goes out, no pharmacy. So if there was a reason for that, I would curious to know what that was at the time.
I think it was just a simple need for a pharmacy downtown. I don't know if it was here, but I, for some reason, have somebody mentioned it to me that the intention was if another pharmacy was located within 1,500 feet or something from this one, the requirement will be voided. I honestly, I don't know if it is in this one or any other document. But yes, we hear you. We don't think, I mean, at this point, we don't think with the dynamic of the downtown, the CVS is coming. If the CVS goes away, another pharmacy probably will come because the demand right now exists in the downtown for a pharmacy. So maybe in 2004, we didn't have as many residential units and so much demand. So we think the market could take care of it right now.
Okay, so there's been a change that will probably be market driven after that. Thank you. The second question that I had was, again, around parking, which I think really, I think we can all agree is the pivotal piece here. Do we know, on those 50 spaces currently, we're getting revenue as a city on those 50 spaces. Do we know what the value is of that parking annually?
Well, right now, we're not getting revenue.
Okay.
At this point, it will be once the project is developed, we will get the revenue for those 50 spaces.
So the restrictive covenant was upon development of the property, not upon conveyance of the land?
Yes.
Okay. And so, you know, to Commissioner Nearing's point, well taken, and our Gale presentation, I think, well timed, that we're in transition and the need for cars still exists. I guess I would be curious in looking at if there's any other areas where perhaps we're redoing a street and there's the availability to transfer that inventory of parking. When we're redoing a street, the buyout, instead of going to a trolley program, could go to kind of transferring that parking to other areas of the city so that the inventory would not be reduced, it would just be transferred. So perhaps another option as we address the changes that are happening in the city.
Any other questions?
I have one more question.
Yes, Madam President.
Thank you. Is there any direct expressed use of the 1,500 square feet that was designated for the pharmacy that now might be undesignated?
With the project?
Correct.
Well, they have a series of amenities for their tenants on the ground floor that they are proposing. They're going to have a restaurant and yoga room and some hair salon and some things. And actually, that's one of the discussions that we are having with the developer right now. Staff is a little concerned that those amenities are only for their tenants and they don't have any interaction with the street. So we're talking with them about that. The project is it's pretty much in compliance with the regulations. It's a good project, lining all the uses with the garage access from the alley. We're just working with them on some issues for that, and how to screen the garage. They are asking for some variances for the active uses, and they need a Class B special use permit for the establishment of the assisted living facility. So they're going through the process and working all those items.
Thank you.
Commissioners, they were looking for some consensus in some directions. So are we comfortable with the direction in which staff is headed?
So just, can I summarize and see if
Absolutely.
I understand it?
Yes.
So
yes,
we
yes.
are okay with the compactor, replacing some of the spaces for the compactor, and then negotiate with the developer to locate as many parking spaces as possible on site, or if it is viable, find additional on-street parking that can be built or another location to preserve as many parking spaces as possible.
Mayor?
Sure.
Yeah, for me, yes. And again, I think, this issue of monthly contribution to the trolley, I think we've talked about this, and I know that we're working through it. The trolley isn't, in my estimation, is not as efficient or maximized as we hope it will be. So even that, throwing money at so yes, maintain as many parking spaces as possible. I think it's at least 1/5 of the commission. That's what I would be supportive of.
Madam President.
Thank you. Have we looked if there are other areas that the trash compactors could go in this area? And is it necessary that they be air conditioned? I don't know what goes into I don't know what kind of garbage goes into the trash compactor, so is that?
This is probably a good test for us. We think it's a much enhanced facility. Will reduce the issues that we have with the compactors on the alleys right now, where they get super dirty. People dump stuff in there because they access without permit. Even the businesses around the Clematis, they will pay an additional fee. They pay right now an additional fee to provide that, to get that service. So we think this will be a much better facility and kind of a showcase for the rest. If we want to improve the conditions of the alley and make them more walkable, making the compactors in an enclosed AC area it's the way to go.
This could be a prototype for other blocks. It just catching a redevelopment of a half block or an entire block where we could do this in advance and incorporate that design into the structure. But we think it's something that's very good. We had sanitation involved in our discussions as well, and they love the idea.
Okay, let me ask the question another way. Is there any objection from the commissioners to staff moving ahead in this direction? Obviously, the final negotiations will come back to us for formal approval, correct?
Yes, Commissioner, yes.
Okay.
Just
Yes,
a comment.
Commissioner.
No objection. Just a comment that I concur with Commissioner Nearing, preservation of as many of those parking spaces as possible. If they can preserve all 50, I think that's ideal. I think that, yes, we're moving toward walkability, bikeability, but I still think that, we're still hearing from our constituents, they're concerned about parking.
All right, and as I said, we do have a parking study that we'll be working on. I do not want to throw out the enhancement or funding of the trolley operation. And while it is the trolleys today, that may morph into some other kind of vehicle going forward. So I'd like to, see if we could preserve some monies for that. But again, the devil's in the details. So reading the room, we'll let staff go ahead and try to cut the best deal that they possibly can. It'll come back to us, and we could tweak it at that point if necessary. Okay?
All right, Ken.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And speaking of parking and transit, Lynn?
This is it. Good morning. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Speaking of transit and parking, right now we run a trolley system in the downtown area, and very popular. We have over 500,000 loading per year on our trolley system. About 2 years ago, we were invited to participate with PalmTran and the RPM study, with their route optimization study. And at that point, we went through a very detailed transit study. essentially what in transit planning, there's like two pieces to it, right? You can, with finite, limited resources, you can have a coverage model or a ridership model. And what that means is a coverage model is everybody gets a service access, but not very frequent. Or you could go with a model that is frequency, high density in areas that will serve. At that time, PalmTrans, serving the overall county level, they decided to go with a coverage model. And so we thought, hey, this would be a good opportunity for the city of West Palm Beach to complement PalmTran and fill in all the gaps and serve our community better. So we hired Jared Walker and Associates, which is internationally acclaimed for his transit planning. He wrote a book on the human transit. And we thought that it would be a really good transition as we are using the same consultant that PalmTran is using to design our study. So before I get into the details of it, I just want to say that what I've learned out of this process is that if you want successful transit, there's really two things that goes into it. It's frequency and like density, right? Where you run the buses and the trolleys where the people are at. And so when we go through this, keep in mind we have a goal, and our goal is to provide additional job access to the downtown area. And for then, our focus is to provide better job access, and how do we connect places, communities, reaching north and south and all the way out west, which there's limited resources right now that connects our people into our downtown area. So we started this process quite a long time ago because it's a very thorough and very comprehensive study to really beginning the discussion on, first is on parking. It's like, can we look at our assets? How do people come get into the city? And the majority of people still drive, and so how do we offset those mode? And as you can see here, during that process, we did two public survey, one in this room in particular, and another one on the online. In addition to that, we presented to all the boards, the chamber, the TPA, and throughout the county to really gain their feedback, to collect information to say, will this work and how can we implement this? So to simply put it, we broke it down to three phases if we're interested in expanding transit in the city. So the first year is essentially adding 2 new trolleys, which we already received a grant for it. It's already being purchased. Right now, based on our schedule, we're thinking of January as implementation and really rerouting the downtown network, and how do we can reach into more of the PBAU market all the way up to the Northwest neighborhood and connecting those neighborhoods. Year 3 expansion is very, very important because this is going to be the first time that we're reaching out west. So if you know that PalmTran itself, the US 1, Route 1 is along Dixie and Broadway, highest ridership. Their other ridership is all the way out to Military Trail. So there's really not much of an east-west connection, and so year 3 really will connect that. And essentially year 5 is going further into the neighborhood. But ultimately, if based on our study, if we follow through with this transit study, we're looking to improve 94% of job access into the downtown area. So again, year 1, this is a little bit further in detail. One of the most interesting thing that I found is we have a tracker on our trolley to see how many ridership and loading we have. And we found that like the top 5 riderships or loading is actually in the Northwest neighborhood. So if you can think about it, like the only food access that these people have is really the Publix downtown. And outside of that, I believe it's the Whole Foods all the way in Palm Beach Lakes. The other thing is we met with a student body president at PBAU, and this is a really, really good market because these students lived in downtown and they live in other areas that they really just need a connection. And then last thing I want to point out is that we have had several conversations on how do we reach into Grandview Heights and the neighborhood down there, and especially the convention center, and how do we get our convention goers into the core downtown area as we're connecting them to Clematis. So I think the year 1 reroute is very exciting for us because we are able to tap into 3 different markets that we don't have currently. Year 3, though, is, it's really interesting because, as I was saying, Route 1 and Route 3 and Palm Tran itself is the higher of all frequency, but the east-west connection is really tough. There are some routes, like I believe Route 43 is an hour in frequency. So it's very challenged. So what we're proposing is really, one, is to use the Palm Beach outlet and the shopping center just south of Westgate, right there on Okeechobee, as the parking ride, right? So how do we get people to do that mode shift? And there is an existing parking ride already at the Palm Beach outlet. So how do we expand on that? And then ultimately, Route B, which currently we have one blue route that goes all the way to Northwood, we want to connect that into, still connect directly from Northwood into downtown, but then taking it south down to Dreer Park and the public shopping center down there. And then ultimately, year 5, we want to connect the hospital and the golf course that we're working on right now. So, we briefly just talked about what is the future of transit, and I know we have very strong sustainability goals and how do we create like a clean environment. But earlier, this is a transit stop, and we're very happy to receive quite a bit of grant funding already up to this point. About 4 years ago, I applied for a grant funding to build out some of our trolley stops that we have in the downtown area. We were awarded $500,000 to build out those stops. In addition to that, we also, at the same year, we received funding to purchase trolleys. And so this is a very important conversation for us to have. Is the future electrification? How do we do that? And so that's a different discussion for another day. But ultimately, let's think about like how much is this going to cost us? This is a very, very costly program. It's like 90% of transit and transit operation itself is in the operations of it. The capital cost is very, quite frankly, not comparable. But right now, we looked at our existing system and how much it's going to cost and the expansion theoretically. So we looked at like what are we, right now the CRA and the DDA is actually funding the project. And earlier, as mentioned, Rick and Anna talked about the transit operation funds that's already established, and we already have been working with developers and collecting funding to help us with the operations. And then lastly, we look at parking and parking revenue as it is an enterprise fund to assist us with this expansion. So we're looking at the parking rate structure. So you might want to say, what about mobility fees? There's all this discussion about mobility fees, but really mobility fees cannot pay for operations. It can only pay for the capital cost of it. So how do we get that? The first thing I want to talk about is quickly about the park, the transit operation funds. And part of our ordinance that we established is like 2 levels of parking maximum between the soft and the hard max. And between there, we collect a fee that has been calculated based on the use of to answer your question earlier, based on the use of the usage, and there's a fee developed. And what that does is actually looked at the trips that's coming into a particular area and offsetting that trips and equating that to a dollar amount. The other thing that we did is, this is 2 years ago, we did a parking study, and that's, there was discussion, it's like, what is our usage in our downtown area? And we look at from a daily use versus an events, and we're very lucky to have a lot of events that, it's very popular downtown. But on an average daily uses, we're only about 61% utilized as a system-wide. And we looked at it not only our assets, but it's the private assets also. But when we look at parking, it's kind of like real estate. Not all parking spaces are created equal. So, of course, people want convenient. They want to be able to go to a restaurant and find a parking spot within that block. So how are we going to look at like optimizing the parking rate structure itself to enhance the user experience within our system? So we looked at SF Park, which they've done an incredible job over there. And how do we incorporate a lot of those recommendations into our study? And we looked at looking at demand-based pricing. And what that means is, like I said, not all parking spots are created equal. So the more popular ones are going to be adjusted, and the ones that's not as popular are going to be reduced to shift the demand, because everybody has a different rate. So we've met with the merchants quite a bit throughout this process, and more recently, we met with them in August, at the end of August, and we developed and fine-tuned our parking policies with them. One of the things that is recommended is, hey, let's turn the garage into first hour free to encourage, better commuter to come in and shop to look at that. The other thing is during event parking, and we had this really lengthy discussion with the DDA. How do we, let's not increase events parking, because our original recommendation is, hey, we need to increase events parking to create more availability. So we agreed, we heard loud and clear of our, our merchants. So we are actually reducing our events fees along here. And then lastly, it's employee, is there anything that could accommodate employee parking itself? And I'll go back to this slide. But we looked at, yes, there are a lot of service employees that work downtown, and how do we encourage better behavior? Because what we found is right now on-street parking after certain hours, because it's free, the employees are parking on street. And so we're proposing to give half off of monthly night employees, and to help mitigate some of that concern that we've heard. There's some other things as office employees and bulk parking that we're offering to encourage economic development. I want to go back to this because one of the things that we are proposing is to extend our on-street to midnight, very similar to City Place. We want to be consistent as we survey different entity around this area. But we are really, what we're proposing is eliminating hourly, because right now it's you put in a couple hours and it's fixed at maybe $1.50 an hour on street. But we're looking at progressive rates, as in these rates are designed to change behavior. So if it's after 2 hours, it's actually cheaper to park in a parking garage. So if you're a long-term parker, we want to shift those demand into the parking garage and create more availability. And then lastly, it's there's this discussions like, hey, we're making a lot of changes on parking itself and the parking structures. So we need to create a parking benefit district in our downtown area, because right now it's not very defined very well of what parking revenue can go to. And so one of the things that we've already awarded as the parking and lighting and parking guidance system, that's going to be very exciting for us. So we'll know how many availabilities are there already. We've already started, as you've probably seen, that there are some wayfinding signs already installed to help direct people to the parking garage. But the more, the more detailed discussion as we're moving, as we're progressing, is like curbside management. How do we help, with TNC, Uber and Lyft, how do we get them to be organized? How do we get freight loading and unloading and organize those strategies on our street? And then the bigger question is can we use this parking benefit district funding to expand our trolley service, and then ultimately implement mobility as a service, as it is like an emerging trend where we connect all mobility solution in one application. I want to say that as we're talking about expanding the trolley, we looked at, hey, what about if we collect fees and revenue? At this point, we are not proposing to collect fees. Our trolley system will be free as it is. And then ultimately, as we're moving into the future, we're hoping to implement more technology-based into our city. And so there are some questions that we hear as we've met with each one of these commissioners already about 3 months ago, that how do we want to progress as we're finalizing these recommendations. And these are the 3 questions that I am seeking for clarification from the mayor and commissioners. So the first question is like, do we want to expand trolley service to be outside of downtown rather than just serving the downtown area? Second is like, what is your comment with the recommended strategy? How do we fund it? How do we make it whole as a system? And then lastly is like, how quickly can we do this? Because there's been some discussions of like setting a 2-stage rates adjustment in our parking fee structure, or should we do as quickly as possible?
Commissioners, questions, comments?
Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor?
Thanks for your presentation. So first, foundationally, which I understand that this question has come to us as a commission, but as I see it, I do want to make sure that, I think on the first slide, we talked about our communication, what we had done thus far. I think, and I know you agree, that will continue just to be a very important kind of golden thread, if you will, throughout everything that we do, especially around any changes to, even as small, and I say small is relative, but, going from 7 p.m. to midnight. I'm not saying that that's a bad decision, but I think in how we communicate that, if that is the pleasure of this administration and commission, those things are going to be super important. So your first question, about expanding the trolley service. I mean, I think we've heard for some time that, especially in areas like the historic Northwest and Coleman Park, Pleasant City, just different areas throughout our city, that there is both a desire and a need. And again, I don't have the answers to that. You're the experts in terms of what that might look like. But I would definitely be on board with looking at expanding the service. But, really taking a step back, I thought some of the conversation was around about how efficient and how do we make better, if you will, our current trolley service in terms of what we're providing. So the answer to the first question for me is yes, but then I think running parallel to that is all the work that it takes to, what is this service going to look like 2 years from now, and how do we support you in that? Because I think we all agree that there's some work to be done about our current system and the way that it works. I'm going to put a period there and just stop. I know there are other questions, but I wanted to just kind of put that out.
Any other thoughts on the first question, commissioners? I mean, I would be in favor of continuing to expand the trolley service. I think that is consistent with what we're trying to do, is to focus on moving people and not cars, particularly in our downtown and throughout our neighborhoods. Palm Tran, I'm glad we're working with them, but I think there are some gaps there that perhaps we can fill. Obviously, the biggest challenge has been and will continue to be funding for the operation, so we'll have to continue to be creative. But if we can move people, and I like the fact that we're focusing on connecting people with jobs, if we could continue to have that as our guiding light to try to connect people from throughout our city to where the jobs are, I think that is a worthwhile goal. All right. Yeah, Commissioner.
I would concur with you, Mayor. I think that any city worth its weight should have a transit system that is commensurate with the quality of the city and life, and the quality of life that we want to provide to the citizens. And so if we can assist, especially the depressed communities in the Northwest and in Pleasant City, we can assist those areas. I think, as the saying goes, that a rising tide lifts all boats, and to give people as many opportunities to succeed is our mission.
Mr. Shove.
Thank you, Mayor. I too am in favor of looking at trolley expansion. The two things I'd like to focus on are equity and efficiency. If we're going to create a system, it needs to be equally accessible to everyone. I know in some of the things we've looked at addressing keenly the issue of Coleman Park and making sure that Coleman Park has equitable access, along with Pleasant City and historic Northwest and other areas of the city. Just going by some of the maps that we've looked at, I want to make sure that I'm on record addressing that area. And then efficiency, if we're also using this to promote transportation to get to jobs, it has to be on time and it has to be frequent, because I can't also be late for my job because the trolley stop was late. So I think when we can start to master those two things, then I'm in favor of moving forward.
Madam President.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I would agree with those sentiments and appreciate your 5-year rollout plan, because I think, as many of my colleagues have said, I think that the importance of the density and the frequency of the trips, similar to the GEL presentation that, if it's not every, so many minutes or so many times in an hour, then people are going to stop and go somewhere else or figure out another way. So thank you.
Okay, so I think you have consensus on that. Commissioner Peduzzi.
Just briefly, I'll say that I concur with the expansion of the plan, and if there's some way of also, connecting the western communities also, if we could keep that in mind, at least maybe not in the near term, but at some point of bringing them into the fold.
Absolutely. Okay, so you have some guidance on that.
Okay. The second question is really geared towards the three funding sources that we've identified. One of it is still continually work with the CRA and DDA to fund part of the trolley system. Second is the transit operations funds that we've established already. And then lastly is using the parking funds to assist and pay for the expansion of the system. And I think that is the question.
All right, Commissioners, how do you feel about the least proposed strategy going forward? Commissioner Shove?
Thank you, Mayor. I think some of our discussion today and the previous item demonstrates a little bit about how I feel moving forward. I'm not opposed to taking some parking funds and using it towards the trolley, but I also want to be mindful that we're keeping that balance so that whenever we're taking a look at how we're using funds, we still have, hard to tell, but the appropriate number of parking spaces are, the appropriate number of parking facilities. But, I just want to make sure that as we do this, we have these conversations frequently about what is that tipping point? What are our constituents saying? That way we're not taking and completely implementing all parking funds over to trolley service, that perhaps trolley service is funding more transportation for tourists rather than citizens, and kind of looking at what that balance is.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I think, let's continue to look at that strategy. I think there seems to be a consensus there. We'll have to, communication is key. Because you're talking about creating some kind of parking district, right?
Yes. So essentially, part of this is maybe we'll go to the next steps on where we're proposing.
I thought you wanted answers to the questions.
Yes. Ultimately, what we're looking for is part of the strategy is adopting, accepting the parking study, and which is already done, but implementing the strategies out of it. So the transit, we want to say yes, we agree to these transit implementation strategy.
Okay.
Yes.
How quickly? My view is let's get it done as soon as possible. But let's see what the other commissioners say. Yes, Commissioner Shaw.
Thank you. I think what's important about this is when we're implementing the parking study finds that our rates are congruent with what the study says, but also I would rather see us communicate out a change in a rollout rather than a phased approach, because I think as you start to do a phased approach, our citizens sometimes forget that this was supposed to be a phased approach, and they feel like rates just keep going up and up and up and up. And I think I'd like to see a really robust communication plan for a one-time fee increase, as it may be, and make sure that everyone knows that that's coming and is prepared accordingly.
Commissioner Neary.
Thank you, Mayor. And I think as long as the the parking experience, this experience is commensurate with the increases. And so I think that that's really important. And again, going back to just this theme of communication and how we communicate it. But at the end of the day, whether it's expansion, whether it's efficiencies, it's us being very clear and methodical and straightforward in terms of why we're doing this, but look what you're getting, so that we all understand that this isn't the same product, right? So we are making some changes, and you're going to feel those changes, but at the same time, your experience is going to be much different, both as a visitor to the city and as a resident or as a business owner in the city. I just think, again, I'm preaching to the choir here. I know we all know that, but I think that that's really important. But I would agree, just, as quickly as we can, given that, we try not to misstep, that we do our very best. But I think sooner the better, obviously.
Okay.
And then lastly,
Next steps.
these are some of the, this schedule shifted quite a bit, but here are where we're at. Ultimately, we're looking at January as we spend the next 2 months rolling out a communication plan.
All right, that's very important, the communication plan and getting the word out there before the actual implementation. And I think part of that should be bragging about the changes to the parking experience, as Commissioner Nearing talked about, how we're upgrading that experience for those who are looking to park in our downtown or proposing to upgrade it. All right? Yes.
So that being said, either before or at that October meeting, would we be able to see what those plans are to communicate that?
Yeah, we would have to come back to a work session to talk separately on our approach to communications as we roll this out, yes.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, very good. Look forward to getting more information. Okay. And let's, Commissioner Baduzzi, item 4, which is safety of children on city-owned properties and at city-sponsored events. Commissioner Baduzzi, do you want to tee this up?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. I'll try to keep it brief, considering the time. Most of you know that several months ago that, well, actually, I brought this up in another workshop, that it came to my attention several months ago, back in June, concerning our library unattended children policy. And it caused me some concern, at least initially, even more so, the fact that our library guidelines allow for unattended children as young as 8 years old to be completely left at the library without an adult anywhere on site, a parent anywhere on site. And it just seemed to strike me as 8 years old is awfully young to have a child completely unattended without any caretaker anywhere on the premises. And my understanding is it was particularly the time of the year is during the summer that this becomes a particular issue, when we have potentially dozens of children that are either dropped off or walk on their own volition to the library. My understanding is the library does have a nice program set up where they do provide lunch or provide drinks and food and things like that for the children. And, I want everyone to understand that I'm not anti-library. I'm not trying to take away a safe zone for kids. To the contrary, I just want to make sure that if we're undertaking to provide a safe place for children, that we truly are providing a safe place for children that will pass muster, both legally and ethically, morally, that, if we have kids there that we know that are there unattended, I think we have an obligation to ensure their safety. When I brought this up initially, city staff had tried to address the issue by simply adding a line in our library rules that says we will not be responsible for any children left unattended. But you can't in one breath say we allow children to be unattended at 8 years old, and then in the next breath say, but we don't have any responsibility for them. And I think Commissioner Riles would probably support me, just as personal injury lawyers, that you can't do that. You can't say that they could be here, but we're not responsible for them. Someone has to be responsible for an 8-year-old. An 8-year-old's just simply too young. What age is old enough to be left? But that's my thought. I know there's been some defensive posturing on the fact on behalf of the library, because I think they feel like maybe I'm here to try to change things, and I really would like to just work with the library and say, hey, how can we make it so that these kids are safe? The things that cause me particular concern are the fact of how many librarians do we have? Are the librarians equipped to handle the number of children that come in during the summer? You know, in a summer camp setting, in a daycare setting, in a school setting, there are certain elements and requirements. You have parental contacts, you have telephone numbers for parents in case of emergency, you have emergency lists such as anything from allergies a child might have, permission to provide emergency medical treatment to a child if they get hurt, permission to transport the child to a hospital. What happens if a fire alarm goes off, you know, while the library is in operation and you have 30 unattended children? Is there some sort of a plan to make sure that we don't have children just wandering around outside now should the fire alarm go off? These are just some things that I just want to make sure that we bring to staff's attention. I'm not comfortable with simply putting the wording in there that we're not responsible for unattended children. I think we got to do more than that. And I hope that we can at least discuss it and come to some resolution without taking that safe place away from the children. I understand that that's a huge concern, that maybe the children are safer even without these rules in place here at our library than at home. But we are not their parents, and we can undertake certain things, but ultimately their parents need to be responsible for that safety unless we've got a plan that contemplates all of these things, you know, a check-in, a sign-in procedure, all that type of thing. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, staff?
Before I turn it over to our to our library director, just let me kind of, the context, and Commissioner Paducci brought this to my attention, and my first reaction was similar. I was like, no, that can't be right. Children 8 years old can be unattended in the library, but I did some research that's exactly the case, and it's consistent with library programs and libraries across the country and across the state and within this county as well. So it really is looking at balancing that equitable access for the children at the library with public safety, and that can be a little bit of a difficult balance. And we looked at, in a broader sense, not beyond libraries, what other public spaces can children access and what kind of restrictions do we place on it or not. And so as an example, in our parks, a child can walk into a park, playground, unattended, and there is no age limit for parks. There are structured programs within our parks, including in our community centers, that then require the child to have a certain age, sign in, and they're paying for that service in many cases, or somebody's paying for that service. Palm Tram allows children as young as 7 to ride unaccompanied in the buses. So that's another example. I thought of myself, actually. When I was a kid, we talked about memorable experiences when Gail was here. When I was a kid, one of the memorable experiences was me and my buddies doing a pickup game at Phipps Park of baseball and just grabbing a bat and a couple balls and some old gloves and playing a little pickup game. And I was probably 10 years old at the time. You know, another memory I had when I was a kid was my mom, God bless her soul, who just passed away, used to work at the Holiday Inn that was where the amphitheater is now. And during the summer, where I didn't have anywhere to go because we didn't have the resources and there wasn't all these programs that exist now, my mom would drop me off at the old library, which was where the fountains are now. And I'd sit there basically the whole day and go through the library, and there wasn't any programming at the time. And I probably was 8 or 9 years old during those days, and fed the pigeons most of the time. That's all there was to do in downtown back then, was feed the pigeons in front of the library. So, I think we need to, and this is a different world, obviously, than 45 years ago when I was a kid or whatever, 40 years ago. But we do need to have that balance, I think, where that we have the access available for these kids at the same time being cognizant of the world we live in and public safety. And I think that the library tries to balance that out. And then I'll turn it over to Chris to kind of talk about what your staff does to ensure that safety.
Okay. Thanks very much. Chris Murray, Library Director.
And I've been doing this stuff for about 41 years. I've worked at Columbia, South Carolina Public Library, Nashville Public Library, Charlotte Public Library, Broward Public Library, and it's pretty typical across the board that 8 years old is typically the age at which you can go to the library by yourself. I remember as a kid, I learned to ride a bike when I was 5 or 6. First place I went was the library, because I had no money. I couldn't go to a store, so I went to a library and I got a library card, and it was the only thing in my wallet. But I gotta say, our library is very safe. Our staff knows these kids. In fact, I can tell you some stories where I have two of my assistant director and my head of children's services have each had individual experience with kids who they've changed their lives. I mean, one of them came up to Lisa when she was first there and said, "I'm going to kill you," And Lisa said, "Oh, we don't kill people here in the library. Let's go get a book," And this kid, his mother, they talked to on the phone once. She never showed up once in the library. He moved to Riviera Beach. He moved all over the place. He kept finding his way back to the library. And he ended up acing the FCAT. He got the highest score in the FCAT, a kid who had, no chance otherwise, basically. And we had another young woman who was going to not graduate because she wanted to play soccer instead. And Jennifer said, "No, you can't do that. You got to make a choice. You're going to take to school, not to soccer," A couple of years later, she was graduating, and she had 2 tickets to the Coliseum, and she wanted Jen to go. And she goes, No, have your family go with you. And she goes, "No, my family doesn't care, I want you to come, But, the physicians have the Hippocratic Oath. Lawyers have legal ethics. The American Library Association has something called the Library Bill of Rights. It started in 1939. And one of the tenets is a person's right to use a library should not be denied or abridged because of origin, age, background, or views. The right to use a library includes free access to and unrestricted use of all the services, materials, and facilities the library has to offer. Every restriction on access to and use of library resources based solely on the chronological age, apparent maturity, educational level, literary skills, emancipatory or other legal status of users violates Article 5. This includes minors who do not have a parent or guardian available to sign up a library card or permission slip. Unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness should be able to obtain a library card regardless of library policies related to chronological age. And I also want to say that we have worked hard for the last 15 years. We've had a volunteer program. We have 40 volunteers go out to our 4 most economically disadvantaged schools. It's called the Let's Read program. We train them how to read aloud to the kids. They do 3 10-week stints over the year. We actually have a foundation give us books to give to those kids, often the only book they have in their house. And those kids come down to the library because of that experience. That's their first connection with the library. And it really does change their life. And I just want to say that, understand, concern for kids, being that young, being out in a library. But if we don't let them in the library, they're basically out on the street, and that's not any safer. And, if we were to prohibit unaccompanied children, of a certain age to not use the library, we would be denying the benefits of the library to kids who have less affluent parents, My parents they both worked. I would have never gone to the library till whatever age, they would have made it up. And it was important for me to go to the library when I was a kid. I used to read, I didn't read my textbooks, but I read all these biographies of American people, these little orange books they had back in the day. And it's because of that I could pass the classes without reading the textbook, You get a kid in the library, you get a kid reading, and it's a whole nother ballgame, And certainly understand, I got to tell you, it's so much safer than the old library. The old library, my God, the kids could run down the hallway to go to the bathroom. They could run straight out the door, out into the street. Here we have a
children's area that is completely safe. It's got a heavy door. The young kids can't get out. It's too heavy. We have mirrors all over the place. If an adult walks into that library unaccompanied by a child, they're challenged by the library staff. Can we help you? What are you doing here? So it's a very safe place. And my assistant director Lisa was talking to a friend of hers, and she said, I want to feed the kids in the library. And her mother worked at the school lunch program. And so, yeah, we give out free lunches all summer long, summer break spot. Next year, Jeff Coons, the next county commissioner, called up, assistant deputy city administrator, and she put her on to Lisa. And so this county started doing it with a few branches. Now they're all doing it. They're doing it in Broward County. They're doing it in Miami-Dade. This is a big thing for kids to be able to, because kids don't want to go back to school during the summer to get a free lunch, but they will come to the library, So I understand the concern, that 8 years old seems rather young, but I don't think there's a safer place for them in the city.
Let me add one thing, because one of the things I think that's really beginning to bear some fruit with the new leadership alignment is looking at things from a perspective that includes various departments. And so, we meet the community services departments that are under me right now meet regularly, and we talk about these issues. And so recently we had Vickers House is now at the library regularly every week, 3 times a week, I believe, and that's bearing fruit. And we just had a discussion about, with these unaccompanied kids that are coming, especially in the summer, as you mentioned, how do we better connect them to some of the more supervised and organized programming that the Parks Department has. And so we're going to be working on those efforts as we get closer to summer, try to engage these parents. And some of these parents are just not engaged, period. But if we can get in touch with the parent and engage them, try to get them to understand that there are other programs available where they'll have that supervision, and they'll be at the parks. They can still visit the library, but we'll have more structure to their lives as well, and hopefully they're engaging their parents. So that's part of the effort, along with some of the safety things. I know are Mr. Key just recently has been going around different parts in the building, and PD and fire, and the library was one of the places that they looked at recently, and it was deemed to be very safe in terms of entrance and exit, especially for the kids.
What safeguards are in place to limit the interaction between, or to eliminate the interaction between children and adults?
As I say, in the children's department, if an adult comes in unaccompanied by a child, they will ask them what they're doing there. They want to know, why are you in the children's department?
So if a 9-year-old wanders into the library, there's staff there to take them to the children's?
Yeah, I mean,
area?
if a staff member sees a young child on another floor, yeah, they'll escort them to the children's department.
Okay.
Yes.
Commissioner Neary?
Thank you, Mayor. Only because I have to leave. I don't think I'll be able to finish this discussion. Definitely appreciate Commissioner Peduzzi and the spirit in which this item was brought. And but I'm totally supportive of not only what's happening here in this library, but as you've articulated, really across the county, state, and country in terms of that. And I think we've all told our stories. I won't tell mine, but I was that eight-year-old kid that was in the library unaccompanied by an adult, not because that adult was working, because there was no adult. So I'm very supportive of us leaving it as such, but totally understand why Commissioner Peduzzi would bring this up. Thank you.
Commissioner Peduzzi?
Yeah, one thing that was mentioned was Vickers House. My understanding is that we're doing some work with Vickers House in our library. That causes me some concern also because of the fact that, we have people now that have dependency issues that are coming into a place where we have unaccompanied children. That's just one of the things. I mean, I think you got to be really careful saying our library is a very safe place. And I've talked to our police officers, our rank and file officers, I've talked to our administrators, and they were all shocked to hear that this was something just as you were when it was first heard. And what some of the line police officers told me is that there's been many occasions where they've encouraged sexual predators, people that they knew were on the sexual predator list, to get out of the library because they're there. They're using the computers. You can't stop them from being there. And that was another thing you brought up. This right to use the library applies to sexual predators. Okay, so they are there. We know they're in the library. I don't think you can say a statement such as our library is very safe when you know there's sexual predators in that library at the same time as unaccompanied children. I think it's an irresponsible thing to say. Now, I know that you're trying to do good, and I know that libraries across the nation are doing this stuff. I think there's some libraries, though, that do have some more restrictions than we have. My understanding is Palm Beach County, the age is a little older.
No, it's 8 at Palm Beach County.
I had heard it was 9 from their director.
I have the documentation
All
right
right,
here. if you'd like to
all right,
see it.
listen.
Yeah, I don't want to get into an argument, but I just,
What is it that you want us to do?
I'm not asking you to do anything. I just want to make sure, if they're telling me these children are safe, fine. But I'll be the first commissioner if something happens to ask some very difficult questions.
Well, I think the one thing we look at is what is the alternative? So the alternatives could be we put more funding into more supervised type programs. That would be one alternative. The other alternative would be to simply not allow them in, which then places them on the street. A lot of these kids don't have supervision after school, so they're alone. So they're with the sexual predators now on the streets, which is even worse. So I want to make a distinction between unaccompanied and unobserved. They are observed. Our staff is observing the children and making sure that, if they're approached by an adult that's clearly not their parent, then they're being questioned. So there is a distinction between unaccompanied and unobserved. They are being observed. But I understand your point. There's no,
Mayor, if I want to follow up, the staffing at the library, though, is different than the staffing at a daycare or a summer camp facility where there's a certain number of children and a certain number of adults. Our library, I have a feeling, doesn't meet that staffing requirement.
I don't know what that staffing requirement is, and this may not reassure you, but in the 41 years I've been working in public libraries, in all these public libraries, there's never been an incident along the lines that you're concerned about.
I hope it stays that way.
Me too. I do too. I mean, and we do work hard for that. If we have a person in mind, our staff looks at them online, sees if they got a record, sees if they're a sexual predator, and they make sure every time he's in the building, they keep him away from the kids. We are vigilant on that stuff.
Commissioner Rouse?
I think I think Commissioner, your heart's in the right place, and given what we do, it does make us more jaded. But I see the young people crossing 2 railroad tracks to come to the library to stay there all day because they have nowhere else to go. And, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Perhaps, maybe you and the library folks can come up with some additional safeguards that would make you feel more comfortable, but given the alternative of not providing the service that the library does and how it impacts lives so significantly, I do understand your concern, but I don't know of a remedy at this point that would not negatively impact a population of people who sorely need the services that the library provides. And if I can just speak up for my staff, this is the best staff I've ever worked with in all the years I've been doing this. We got a grant 8-9 years ago from the Jim Moran Foundation to start an after-school homework center, K-5. And usually they only fund for a year or two. They funded us for 5 or 6 years, and they said, what happens when they become teenagers? Well, we got nothing. So they funded a teen homework center, The staff does such a good job that outside funders look at them and they say, this is done well,
Okay.
Mayor, if I may.
Yes, Commissioner Shaw.
Thank you. Excuse me. I certainly understand that safety is priority here. And Commissioner Peduzzi, I know the library has keenly come into focus, but we have what I consider the library, the public realm, like any other park, like any other place in the city, where you're going to have interactions between groups of people that typically may not happen. So I think safety, to me, is the thing that I hear out of this conversation. Like, if there's an ask for me, it's how can we do better at safety? Because at the end of the day, the argument comes down to equity, and I am by no means prepared to allow a population of people that are using the library as a place, as a safe haven, to not have that safe haven. I was very fortunate to have two parents, one of which could stay home with me. Not everyone is that fortunate. And I'm not willing to put in place a policy that would exclude those that weren't as fortunate. So I guess my ask would be, you know, to Mr. Fana's point, what else can we do? You know, if there are places where we can be better supportive, you know, let's not be exclusionary, let's be inclusionary. Let's find out a better way that we can create some safeguards. So that I would certainly be supportive of creating a better safe place, putting in place more safeguards. If that included dedicating funding, certainly doing that. But I am supportive of the policy that's currently in place with the age.
Yes.
Briefly.
Please.
The library, though, is a unique place because of the fact that you can't ban sexual predators and the like from being there. In a park, a sexual predator can't come within a certain number of feet of a child. I mean, it's written into law. At a library, they can. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. So all I would ask, and you're correct, I should at least ask, is that we do everything possible to, you know, to make sure that we have the adequate staffing with the children that are there. And, you know, if we can come up with some sort of an accountability system or some sort of system that the fire alarm goes off, that we know where the people are going to be, you know, meeting, that everyone, staff knows that. And you may already have that in place. I don't know. But if you could just do those things and do the best we can with what we have.
And we'll be happy to. And I just want to mention one more thing. There's a study in the 60s. Children from less affluent homes, by the time they're 3 years old, more affluent children have 30 million more words, vocabulary words, than those other kids. Those are the kids we need to get into the library. You know, they are most in need of the resources.
We will look at ways that we can beef up the safety of the kids, for sure. I'll get back on that. We'll report that back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioners, we're running short on time. Just briefly, I don't know if Phyllis has reached out to you or we're trying to schedule a meeting for the transition team to report. We were going to do it, then Dorian interfered. So please check your calendars. I think there's an email that went out. We're hoping to maybe have a couple of hours next Monday and then do another 2 hours later in the week. So just, if your schedule permits, I mean, I know you all have very active lives, but that's what we're trying to do, is to reschedule that presentation from the transition team. All right? That's all I have. Meeting adjourned. Thank you all very much. Very productive meeting.